All right, well, let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 21. First Samuel chapter 21. So when we left David last week, he was in a really bad spot. Saul, king of Israel, Saul wants him dead. He's not safe. He can't go back to the palace. He can't go back home to his wife. He can't go back home to Bethlehem, to his father's house. According to chapter 20, David basically has to hit the trails. He has to go on the run. This is the stretch of Scripture that they call David's Exile. There are stories here of David's wanderings, adventures, and troubles while he is on the run. This covers a few chapters here. Of course, we're not going to cover more than one chapter tonight, but there's a stretch of chapters here where David is on the run. And amidst the failures and successes of these chapters, you want to keep the overall context in mind that he's a hunted man. He's on the run. Saul wishes him to be killed. When Brother John was preaching through the book of Psalms and came to Psalm 34, he referenced this chapter here, chapter 21. There were two different psalms that are written that have 1 Samuel chapter 21 in mind. Psalm 34 is one of those. And we've kind of set the scene for the past couple weeks on what this chapter, of all the things that precede this chapter. David's hunting by Saul, David going on the run. And so tonight we begin to look at David's exile as we cover chapter 21. And we will look tonight at Ahimelech and Achish. Okay, number one, David and Ahimelech. It says here in verse number 1 that then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? So as soon as David goes on the run, and he's been on the run for at least a few days at this point, you find that out later, but he makes a stop here. He makes a stop here where the priests are gathered, or at least a couple of priests that you will find out. Ahimelech by name is mentioned here. And when he shows up, the fact that he shows up alone really spurs a question from Ahimelech, right? This is a red flag. If you don't grasp what Ahimelech is asking there when he says, Why art thou alone and no man with thee? What do we know about David? What is public knowledge about David at this point? He's a hero in Israel, that he's a servant of the king, that he is the king's son-in-law. And if you're not sure what that means, shouldn't there be like an entourage with David? Like, shouldn't there be people with him of some kind? When he shows up and he's alone, and it's obvious that he looks tired and he looks weary, maybe disheveled a little bit. Ahimelech doesn't necessarily know of the conflict yet. That's not yet public knowledge. The priest here at the house of God is not aware that Saul is hunting David. And when David shows up all alone, like something's wrong. Something has happened. It says there in verse number 1 that he was afraid at the meeting of David. It just doesn't make sense to him why David would be alone, right? Saul's servant, Saul's son-in-law. This guy's a hero in Israel. And now it's like this guy comes crawling out of the woods all by himself. Something's up. It doesn't take long to figure that out. Listen, it's going to be hard for a guy like David to go on the run. Why is that? Well, if there's one guy that's probably going to get recognized a lot of places, it's the current hero in the nation, right? The one that everybody likes, the one that everybody loves. They sing his praises. David's going to have a hard time hiding. He'll find success in hiding, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with great difficulties. You're not to assume that David just runs off after meeting Jonathan and, well, as long as he, wanders through the woods and the back alleys, he'll never run into anybody. Nobody will ever recognize him. This is going to be easy. Not so much. Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? Well, David gives his answer in verse 2. David said unto Ahimelech, the priest, the king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now, David is not incredibly forthcoming with the truth here, is he? When David mentions that he's on business from the king. Was David on business from the king? No, of course not, right? Now, David left after the king had some things to say, but those things weren't to David. Those things were about David. And David is not completely honest here in an attempt to keep himself safe, in an attempt to keep himself alive. He doesn't share the real reason yet why he is there. He doesn't share all the situations that led up to this moment. Verse number 3, but he kind of gives a clue as to why he's there in that moment. Verse 3, now therefore, what is under thy hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. Now this kind of gives you the answer as to why David is there in that moment and for what purpose. He's hungry. David's been on the run. There's no McDonald's in Israel. Sorry, bud. He can't just show up anywhere. He's been in the wilderness. He's been on the run, and it's been a few days. And guess what? If you get hungry after a few hours, guess who's probably hungry after being on the run for a few days? And so David asks them there, what can you give me? You got a handful of loaves there. Whatever you've got here, I'll take. What can you do for me? What can you give me? David is hungry. We are not here there are different commentators that take 2 vastly different approaches to what's going on here, right? There is the camp that says that David is doing all that he can to protect himself and that God is preserving him. And there's another camp that say David shouldn't have done any of this because David lied, David wasn't honest, David should have never brought other people into this, he should have never gone to the priests and lied to them like that. 2 totally different camps, okay? So before you make your judgments, know that somebody has made those judgments before, and there's a wide variation here of what people think. We're not here to condemn David for what he has done. You're actually going to find a little bit later, we'll talk about it, the Lord references this story. Jesus references this story. Now, in verse 4, the priest answered David and said, there's no common bread under my hand, but there is hallowed bread. Well, if this is indeed the house of God, there's not just, common bread laying around, or as the priest would indicate, yeah, there's bread. I'm not sure it's bread I can give you. This is hallowed bread, right? Show bread. Bread that had been sanctified. Bread that had been set apart. Bread that was really supposed to go to the priests. They would cook the show bread, and then from Sabbath to Sabbath, they would replace it. And then as they would replace the old bread with fresh bread, the priests then could take of that old bread and they could eat of it. They could have it with their families. It was kind of a priestly thing. That bread that had been sanctified, that had been hallowed or set apart for the Lord's worship and the Lord's service. And that's kind of the indication there when he says there's no common bread. In other words, there ain't no bread I can give you. This is holy bread. This is hallowed bread. But he does give the indication that even though it's hallowed, he might be willing to part with it. He's not just going to be casual with it, though. Okay? Those things that were considered holy, even if he gives it away, he knows that it's not to be treated casually. It was regarded as separated. He wasn't going to just distribute it. So he says there in verse number 4, there is hallowed bread if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. This bread was really set apart for the Lord's service. And it's not really common bread. There's a willingness there, but you have to give me some assurances here that, who you're feeding with this, that this isn't just going to any whoozy what's it's that's unclean and it's not actually, qualified per se, able to take this. The priest is really kind of guarded here, right? He's like, well, what do? I've got bread that's hallowed. I'm not really supposed to give it to anybody, but this guy's in a desperate spot. This guy's in a terrible spot. I want to help him. At least you and your company are ceremonially clean, right? That's kind of the question there, that you've kept yourselves from women. You can read Exodus, you can read Leviticus and understand what the priest means by that. He wants to make sure that they're at least in some form or fashion ceremonially clean. Verse number 5, David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days, since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. I want you to think about that phrase. The bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. There is a recognition here that it can be given to the common, even if it was sanctified, even if it was made holy. Now, I think David and the priest both recognized something, and it was this: the need superseded the ceremony, right? The need superseded the ceremony. Now, the priest knows, as a general rule, this is not a good idea. This has been separated and intended for a specific ceremony, for a specific purpose. And yet here comes this guy stumbling out of the woods. He's famished, he's hungry, he's desperate. And he says there, David says there, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. Could it be that sometimes the need could overrule the ceremonial use? And the answer is yes. In the book of Matthew chapter 12, Jesus talked about this. Jesus talked about this event. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus was criticized by the Pharisees. You'll be surprised to hear that, right? Jesus is being criticized by the Pharisees because, let's just begin reading, Matthew 12, verse 1. At the time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered, and he began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. And he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. You guys remember that story when they criticized Jesus that as he was walking through the fields and he was walking with his disciples and it was on the Sabbath day, and they got hungry and they would reach out for the stalks and they would take some of those kernels and they would eat. And the Pharisees like, no, you can't do that. Jesus, are you going to let your followers do that? I mean, it's the Sabbath day. They're not allowed to do that. And Jesus, his response was, do you not remember? He goes all the way back to someone they would have been really familiar with and somebody they would have adored in King David, right? You remember when David went in and He ate the showbread, which really was bread that was actually set apart for a different purpose. And he gave it, and he ate it. He ate of that showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him. Or how about this, verse 5? Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath? Did you know that the priests profane the Sabbath? Now, on the Sabbath day, you're not supposed to do any work, right? Guess who works on the Sabbath day? Guess who sheds blood? Guess who makes sacrifices? Read in the book of Exodus and read in the book of Leviticus. Read about the offerings, even the ones that were required twice on a Sabbath day. And the Lord says, you want to talk about the Sabbath day? You know, the priests profane it. The priests, by doing their very jobs, they profane the Sabbath day. And he says in verse number 6, I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known that what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. Can you believe that he just said these people profaned the Sabbath and then used the word guiltless? Can you believe? He just talked about David taking bread that was not lawful for him to take and then called him guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. There was a recognition in what happened here that yes, though this was set apart, the need, right? What do we talk about? We talk about acts of necessity. And David was hungry. David was starving, and the priest gave him of that bread. The preservation of life was the most hallowed use of that bread that could have been done that day, right? David comes, he's starving. Anybody that's with him, they haven't eaten for days. And the priest is smart enough and able enough to see, you know what, this has been hallowed to God. But these guys are desperate. And just in like manner where the Lord could say that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, that he was able to see that he would have mercy and not sacrifice. In this scenario, the need superseded the ceremony. Okay? There's not any indication here of the Lord condemning either the priest or David for what happened here in this situation, right? It was wise, right? This was wisdom to recognize this. Even if, in a manner of speaking, David's initial contact with the priest was not completely honest. He was technically ceremonially clean. He had not been with women. None of his company had been with women. Whether or not that was their choice or not, they hadn't been for these days that they were on the run. And the priest is willing to part with some of this bread. So it says in 1 Samuel 21 verse 6, so the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So the priest, in making the fresh and making the hot bread, was willing and did part with some of that bread that probably would have been reserved for him, would have been reserved for his family, for other priests, and he made the decision to give David and his company some of that bread. Okay? He recognized that it can be common, even if it's holy. Right? So the Lord recognized this, and then the Lord was really pointed to the Pharisees that you talk about me and my disciples breaking the Sabbath, and you don't have any idea what the Sabbath is all about and how it has been observed in times past by David, by this priest, by other priests in their services. The Lord was not one that you wanted to contradict. He knew better than anybody the Old Testament, what was required and what was intended by that. All right. Number 2, David and Doeg. David and Doeg. So David's got some food, right? David's got some bread. David's temporarily, okay, we'll call this a win, right? He's found maybe a safe harbor. He's got some food. Let's read verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. Now, this is one of those non-coincident kind of things, right? Well, it just happened that while all of this was going on, there's someone who was, what does it say there in verse 7? He was detained before the Lord. There was someone there who was on some kind of business, who was there in some kind of effort, and was held there or detained there, and kind of sees all that has gone on, whether it's from a small distance or what. He's kind of aware of what's going on. Now, who is it? Well, his name is Doeg, and he is an Edomite. Now, whether he was really born to the Edomites as a race, or if he's like an Edomite because that's where he's from. He's a Jew from the region of Edom, right? Like Uriah the Hittite, the where you're talking about where somebody's from, not necessarily their lineage. No matter. But Doeg is a rat. And we're going to read about that next week when we get into chapter 22. Because you and I just saw David come out of hiding, get some food from the priests, and it's all witnessed by this man named Doeg. You're not given a lot of information yet, but what you are given in verse number 7 is an indication that this man is loyal to King Saul. Now, keep that in mind. We're going, like I said, we're going to talk about it next week again, but just keep in your mind that all this that we just saw, the help that David just got, the friendly help from the priest, Doeg sees this. And Doeg is loyal to Saul. Well, in verse number 8 it says that David said unto Ahimelech, and is there not here under thy hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. When David sees it, right, Doeg's in the area, he realizes he's in trouble. And David doesn't have any weapons, does he? When he met Jonathan, it was don't go home. You can't go to Bethlehem. You can't go back home to Michal. You got to go. You just got to run. So David and whoever might have been loyal to him that went with him, they don't have anything. They didn't have any food. And you find now David doesn't have anything to defend himself with. And he asked the priest there in verse number 8, if you have spear or sword. I don't have anything with me. Do you have a spear or sword? Now, if you read the Old Testament, and you read the garments of the priesthood, you will not find that they generally carried swords. That's not part of their equipment. That's not part of their robes. That's not part of their garments. The priest doesn't have anything, right? Verse number 9, though, he says, the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt, take that. If thou wilt take that, take it. For there is no other save that here. And David said, there's none like that. Give it me. The only weapon that was close was what? The sword of Goliath. Now, that's not coincidence, right? Now, the sword of Goliath was a testimony. That was a memento, right? And it appears from this context, from these verses, that story that we read all the way back in 1 Samuel 17, right? A story we all know, we're all familiar with, we all love that story where David kills Goliath. He kills that giant. Sometime after that, they took that sword and they kept it. They kept it as like a memento. I don't know that trophy is the right word, as much as like a memento or a memorial or something. And the priests were keeping that, and they were keeping that there at the house of the Lord, and they were keeping it there behind the ephod. That's amazing, right? To think that they kept that. They kept that testimony. They kept that marker of what David had done all that time before. And David, he sees it. He's like, no, there's no sword like that. I'll take it. Give it to me. And you just wonder, right? The last time David held that sword in his hand. You remember chapter 17, where he was showing forth just that dynamic and wonderful faith. The last time that David held that sword, he was on top of the world. Now he's at the bottom. Right? How time changes things, right? And David now he's afraid. He's weary. He's on the run. He's asked for help. He's got a little bit of food, and now it's been witnessed to and it's been seen by this enemy of what he could only assume would be his enemy, somebody who's loyal to King Saul. Doeg, it's mentioned to us in verse 17, or verse 7, is one of the chiefest of his herdmen. He's one of the servants of Saul. David's been recognized. He can't hide that, right? I need a weapon. And he's not intending to go kill Doeg right now, but he does need something to defend himself. That's the difference here. David's not trying to run off and start to kill all of Saul's servants. He's not trying to start a civil war in Israel against Saul and all of Saul's servants, but he wants to protect himself. He is fearful for his life. He is fearful that he is in danger, and he asks for help. And the only thing they have is a sword he's familiar with, but they had kept that all that time. And I think that's an amazing testimony there. What a difference. Number 3, lastly, David and Achish. In verse number 10, it says that David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. What a decision, right? Brother John talked about that when he prefaced the discussion on Psalm 34 by going back and telling us this story. It tells us there in verse number 10 that he went to Achish, the king of Gath. That doesn't make any sense, does it? Go to Gath? What a decision. That was Philistine territory, right? Do you remember 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4? Goliath of Gath? This was a Philistine hotbed. This is where Philistines are from Ashdod and Gaza and Gath. And David chose to go there. What does that tell you about David's situation? If he was willing to go into the hotbed of enemy territory, he was afraid. And he knew Saul was out to get him. And now, here's another location that's been given away. Here's somebody else that's seen this. He's got to go again. And he runs. And he would rather go to Gath than stay anywhere in the area that he just was recently, knowing Saul's going to be on the hunt for him. Saul is going to be on the lookout, and they're coming for him. So he goes to Gath. That's an interesting decision, but it speaks to how fearful he was of Saul. When it says, verse 10, that he fled that day for fear of Saul, going to Gath explains how deep that fear was. Verse 11, and the servants of Achish said unto him, is not this David, the king of the land? Now, I wasn't kidding earlier when I said David can't hide places, right? David gets recognized when he goes places. And when he goes to Gath, they spot it, right? They spot him. They can tell. Is not this David, king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? They recognize David, and they know what David has done. When it says that Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s, David wasn't killing tens of thousands of Jews. You know who David was killing? Philistines. And now he's in Philistine land. and they recognize him. We know who you are. You're David. You're the one that they sing about with all the Philistines that you've killed. And it says in verse 12 that David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. Not only is he afraid of Saul, now he realizes he's in trouble he's in trouble in Gath. He is in trouble with those that are surrounding him of the Philistines. It says in verse 12 that he laid up these words in his heart. Now I want you to turn real quick. We're not going to take a look at the entire psalm. I actually just want to read a verse or two. But Psalm number 56. Psalm 56. You guys will forget this in about 21 weeks when Brother John gets there. Psalm 56, and read the superscription there. To the chief musician, and I'll pass over those words I can't pronounce, but it says, when the Philistines took him in Gath. When the Philistines took him in Gath. Now the Bible told us that in 1 Samuel 21 that there were words that were in his heart. When they told David, we know who you are and we know what you've done, David knew he was in trouble. And he knew what they planned to do to him. And it says there in Psalm 56 verse 1, be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresseth me. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up. Lord, I need your mercy. I'm sure not going to get it from these guys. David recognized that if the Lord wasn't merciful to him, he wasn't going to get mercy from the Philistines. It was it. It was going to be over. They were going to swallow him up. They were going to destroy him. His life was going to be over. They've just admitted, we recognize you. We know who you are. We know what you've done. And David, in fear, he begins to hide these words in his heart, and he begins to utter, in his mind, in his heart, in his soul, these prayers that are recorded in Psalm 34 and Psalm 56, things that were later penned down that we could keep, that we could have, and remember some of what's going on in his mind. You and I read 1 Samuel 21, and of course, it looks scary, right? If we were watching this on a screen, it would be scary. We know he's surrounded. We know he's in trouble. They've caught him. They're going to kill him. And yet, these Psalms that David wrote get you into his mind and get you into his heart, into what he was feeling, into what he was thinking and praying to God. Lord, please be merciful to me. These guys won't be. He realized that his only hope and his only help was if the Lord delivered him. And so I look forward to getting to that psalm later when Brother John gets to it. And when he was taken, and when those Philistines confessed, we know who you are and we know what you've done, David knows, well, then Lord, I'm in your hands. And if you don't deliver me, I guess this is it. They're going to swallow me up. Now, the Lord does deliver him. In this passage, we see what David did. Now, how the Lord used that, or how all of that works together, I'm not sure. But the rest of 1 Samuel 21 tells us what David did. David put on an act. Now, David's a good actor. David was able to convince God's priest that he was on a mission from King Saul, right? He was able to convince the priest of that. But this is something entirely different. This is not someone who's friendly to him. This is enemies. And he goes a different route with this. Still deceptive in a manner of speaking, still not honest and forthcoming, but he does what he does to try and preserve his life. And God allows his life to be preserved and helps him. It says there in verse 13 that he changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad. Now, we use the word mad, and we often mean angry, but the technical word for mad is crazy, right? Insane. And he feigned himself mad in their hands. He scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and some commentators note, like scratching. Some note that the scratching, like it's almost like a scratching with intent. Like, was he like trying to scratch words or drawings or pictures or something? That he looked crazy. He just looked like a man insane, scratching and clawing at these gates. He let his spittle fall down upon his beard, right? Didn't try to exercise any control. Spit all over himself. Spit where it could run down his beard, right? It sounds gross, right? I see the girls here making some faces. This is the guy that was just anointed to be king over Israel someday. This is a man who once stood over a Philistine champion with a sword in his hand and cut his head off. This is a man who has led multiple battles and victories over the Philistines. And now he's so low that in an attempt to save his own life, he's humiliating himself. He's put on a total pretense and pretending to be insane here. David has not really lost control of himself, but he's humiliating himself in hopes that they will see that he's crazy. And they do. In verse 14 it says, Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see the man is mad. Wherefore then have ye brought him to me? This guy's crazy. What do you do with bringing him here? Have I need of this madman, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? The king here, King Achish, he sees David and he just thinks, this is pathetic. You've brought a madman. If this is David, if this is the hero of Israel, look at the pathetic lot that he has made of himself. Look at what has become of him. He's not even worth our attention. He's certainly not worth bringing into my palace, into my kingdom. Is not worth bringing before us. Shall this fellow come into my house? And David is going to escape out of this situation. Now I read chapter 21, and we're done with it now, and we're not going to try to cover any of chapter 22 tonight. But I want you to see the fear that has come over David. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have faith, right? It's not that you can only have one, and if you have faith, you'll never have fear. And if you have fear, that means you don't have faith. No. David is the example that's rubbish. That's not true at all. But I want you to see that the great hero, he's afraid. When we say that David is on the run and hiding for his life, that is reality. This is a real situation with a real hero from Scripture that is down in the dumps. He is down in a very low place. He has had to resort in an attempt to save himself and any that might have been with him. He's had to lie to a priest, and he's had to humiliate himself in front of his enemies. Do you think David wanted really to stand there and foam at the mouth and spit all over himself and act crazy? Would not David have rather taken a sword and tried his best to wipe out all of those Philistines? But notice chapter 21 shows us the reality of where David is right now. This is a low place. It is not beyond God's people going through times when they are desperately low. And David feels incredibly low at this point. He doesn't know who in the world he can trust, and he's kind of made a scene of himself here because he's fearful for his life. We don't condemn David. I'm not at all going to be obnoxious and come down on David because of what has happened here in chapter 21. This shows you the depths of the reality of someone who knows a king is hunting him. And if they get their hands on him, they're going to kill him. Okay? Now God has preserved David and God has saved David through this situation. And we're going to see a little bit in chapter 22 next week that slowly some folks start to rally to his cause. And David starts to get a little more help, a little bit of a following. But that doesn't come until you've found David about as desperate can be. Did you know that, right? I have not spent a lot of time in my life going through like these stretches of scriptures. We don't preach from them a lot just because it's not really doctrinal stuff. It's really just history stuff. But I think sometimes I'm guilty of this, and you look at the Old Testament and you think about our heroes and you talk about David, and we always think of all the highlights, right? And we don't often remember, like, this guy had times he was weary. He was afraid, and he was down in a desperate situation. And yet the Psalms are able to reassure us that in those times, it tells you what was in his heart. He was afraid. He was worried. He was fearful. And yet in those times, he cried out to his God. He cried out to the Lord. And there's a great balance. There's a great mix there. If we keep in mind the reality of the situation and then what was in his heart, I think you'll find that David is a hero to all of us because he reveals all of the struggles that we go through, where we're crying out to the Lord for help, and I need it, Lord, because I'm in a bad way here, and we realize our hopelessness without him. All right, we'll cover more next week. Let's